Scandi Pitches, Scandi Singers. Welcome back to Scandi Pitches.
Hey!
And I tried to play a little nice intro there, and then I immediately got an error message saying that it's overloading. So maybe it didn't work, but
dear.
I'll have to check back. It's doing these live streams is still it's a bit of a learning experience. How are you doing, Therese?
I'm alright, thank you. Yeah, less overheated than last week. It's gorgeous weather today. How are you?
Yeah, I'm alright. I mean, you know me, I hate the heat and I don't like being too warm, so that's my opinion on the matter. But hey, at least I get to talk about singing today, so that makes me happy.
Yay! Yeah.
So today we are discussing the something I've actually looked into in my episodes, which is the concept of solo singing versus ensemble singing.
Yeah.
Though,
and I distinctly remember being involved in
yes.
episode that looked at that.
Yeah, you did. Oh, it was a lot of
Fun
work.
experiments.
It was a lot of work, but we got a lot of people in. It was nice, and it was really interesting also to hear how it all worked when we put people together. So
I also think it was the first outing for Knut's magic dip,
Knut's magic dip.
which has since become legendary.
It's not. I mean, yeah, it's a really tasty. I didn't invent it, but I don't know. For some reason, it was just a hit. So
You've made your own modifications to the recipe.
Yeah, but now I have to make it every time there's a social event. I have to make my dip. So
Yes.
But hey, great.
Only
At least it's easier to make than something else. So solo singing versus group singing. Now, Therese, you've done both.
Yes.
I've done both. I mean,
I thought I was going to be accused of a crime there.
No, but so what I mean is that you could, and I think, I mean, for a lot of singers this is the case, but like for some, you might think that they're a singer that thrives in solo singing, or they're a singer that thrives in group singing. And then you have some people that can do both, which I would consider you to be part of that group.
Thank you.
So I thought it's also then very interesting to ask you, how do you approach doing the different ones? So let's start with, if you got, and of course style will come into play as well, but let's say that you're preparing to do, a pop song, and you're performing as a soloist. Do you have any sort of approach that you would employ?
Well, if I'm performing as a soloist, then it's kind of up to me to interpret what I'm singing.
Yeah.
And I mean, like pop specifically, I'm not sure it matters, but like any sort of song, I think it's up to me to sort of, I have a little bit more control over what sound I want. And then obviously it depends on who is asking me to do it and what they want, or if I'm doing it for my own high pleasure or as part of a project that I'm the boss of. Like how much artistic license I'm given as the soloist, because just because you're the soloist doesn't necessarily mean do what you want. But assuming I can do what I want, I do that.
Yeah.
A little bit, slightly different. Whereas obviously, compared to singing in a group, you have a more collective responsibility for what the piece is doing. Yeah,
we'll get onto a group in a minute. Just looking at your solo experiences, have you had, I mean, I know that you've done music for your own place, and then of course you're free to do pretty much what you want. Have you been in a situation where someone else has had you as a soloist and they're giving you loads of instructions and looking for a very specific sound from you?
Yes, I have. And I have been both in sort of musical contexts with, I mean, to be honest as well, like singing some of your pieces. I mean, to be fair, I have been very free with the sort of the solo stuff that you've written. For example, the sort of sung poetry with poems by Karin Boye Swedish poet that you've set music to, I feel like I've been quite allowed to have quite a lot of artistic license and freedom
But
in interpretations.
have you
but at the same time,
experienced the opposite though?
yeah, I have. But yeah, in a theater context, I have worked with like I once worked with a director, like uniquely a play that I was just, or a performance piece that I was just in, where I hadn't written it, or I hadn't been involved in the sort of production of it as such. And there were quite a lot of specific sounds, and also, and there was still sort of soloist stuff, and kind of like some of it atmospheric, some of it very much solo. I was basically just a human soundtrack to that to that play, or part of the human soundtrack. There was another singer as well. But the tricky thing there was that it was not necessarily, it was someone who obviously like had a lot of like ideas for music and was keen to work with music, but not someone from a music background. So it can be quite tricky to sort of interpret exactly what someone wants when they're asking you to search for the quality. Like, well, I mean, not quality as in sort of good, bad, but like search for a specific quality that in itself was a bit abstract. But you just got to keep searching.
Yeah, I mean, this whole concept of how does a musical director communicate with a singer? I don't know. I guess it's kind of a little bit like what we talked about last week, which is the way singers kind of get a bit of a separate treatment from the instrumentalists, where you'll have an MDC. Oh yeah, let's do this line legato, and here I want a bit of spiccato on those lines, and they'll use stuff like that. And then with a singer, they'll be like, imagine that you're a flower and you're growing, reaching up towards. I'll be like, just
And I think, to be fair, like, I mean, it's I think there are different expectations on singers compared to instrumentalists sometime in terms of what they know, or sometimes as well. But yeah, it's I actually really love being given direction with singing. I mean, and specifically like working in recordings and in studios. I think it's always quite exciting if someone is able to bring stuff out in you, or to and you feel like you're able to shape the sound that they want as well. It's really fun. Like I did a demo recording for an advert not too long ago that was just which I love that sort of stuff, because you're singing pretty much the same lines as everything from like a 2-year-old to an opera singer. So actually, like, being given direction but being given a certain amount of freedom of interpretation with what you do with it as well is like that's usually the ideal partnership. But it's super satisfying to be able to produce with your voice the sound that someone wants. I think.
And I think when we work in the choral sphere, especially when we're talking about the high level professional choral sphere, there is more of that happening. And I find with the musical directors I've worked with, when it's a high stakes choral kind of situation, there is a lot more of that happening. There is a lot more of people saying, okay, we want legato here, this line, this, we would want this to be sung in this way, and then very like quite specific. Which I guess when you get to the professional level in the field, that kind of goes across the board. I think you have a musical director who knows what they want, and they'll tell you to do it.
How to communicate it.
And how to, and very importantly so, knowing how to communicate and then of course and then adapting to whatever
Yeah.
the musicians need. So let's talk about group singing, because group singing is of course, I mean, I guess it's no secret that I do choir. That's what I do. And
What, really?
and so but the concept of group singing, and even just like group music, creating sounds together and how they interact, not just emotionally, but also literally scientifically, like how do these sounds stack on top of each other, how do they change each other's quality. It's an extremely fascinating field, I think. Now with singers, what's really interesting is, of course, there's such a wide plethora of sound you can get out of singers, and so but then when you put them together in a group, very often you're looking for the unified sound, which imposes certain hits your microphones.
So angry as a person.
It imposes certain challenges to singers. Have you felt, how does your approach to singing change when you're in a group setting and you're not just the soloist who's performing as the featured?
Yeah, I mean, so much about sort of listening and adapting to each other, but the fine balance of like still delivering what you've got to deliver. But yeah, I think even though, I mean, I think listening is obviously it's key in whatever you do, whether it be as a soloist or as something else, but like particularly important when you sing in a group, and obviously particularly important when you sing a cappella in a group. And yeah, it's just, I actually really, really like that sort of the balancing of sounds, and the feel of everybody kind of carrying each other, like in the best of circumstances, when you just know that you're singing with a bunch of people where you all can trust each other enough, and you do trust each other enough to have fun with it and to play with it, and and you know that even if things were to go wrong, or someone makes a mistake here, or
go wrong? What are you talking about?
Drops a baby in your arms all of a sudden in a department store, which happened to one of our singer friends once. In the middle of a set. You know that because of the people you're singing with and because of the group, you know that anything is going to be absolutely fine and it's going to be okay. But yeah, I think also so different in terms of like what kind of group singing and what's needed of me as an individual as part of a particular group. Like very different, for example, I think singing one to a part than singing two to a part. Like obviously two to a part can be quite tricky.
Yeah, it's a notoriously tricky setup to two to a part.
But also hugely satisfying when you end up with either someone you've sung with a lot and you just know each other's voices, and you blend well, or you know how to adapt your voice so that you blend well. But, it can be, it's obviously quite lovely as well.
It's a very fascinating thing, because what I've experienced, and I think a lot of people experience this as well when they do group singing, as that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. The overall sound of the group, even if each singer might have their own quirks and flaws, but they're all kind of ironed out in the whole
and balanced by each other.
And it's really fascinating. But yeah, if you've got, especially in smaller groups, you need to be very careful. And we did a little, I called it a video study. It was a very, very small study where we looked at two things. Ensemble, which is sort of the fancy French word for essentially together. And usually
for together.
But it literally means together. But
also,
it's it's generally used to describe musicians playing together. And then we looked
at a group of actors.
Or anything. It's anything you want to sound fancy and artful, you call it an ensemble rather than a group playing together.
An ensemble of oranges in my fruit bowl.
Exactly. But yeah, we looked at that, and then there's the very divisive topic of vibrato, which is definitely something that I know that I will employ differently when I'm singing as a group singer and as a solo singer, and it's of course it all has to do with blending, and blending is something we strive towards in the West. We want to create this unified sound. At least we used to. I mean, we're talking, back in the 1700s, that was ensemble is all, and you got to sound smooth and balanced. And you look in the orchestra, all the instruments basically have the ability to play very smoothly, and that's very very much by design. And so when you're singing in a group, you're kind of you're partaking in a tradition that very much favors smooth sound. And so I find when I'm singing with a group, that's what I have to just adjust my mind to focus. Right, I need to make sure I'm listening. I've heard it described as singing with your ears, which I think is a very very beautiful
I think that's
description.
A great description of what you have to do.
Yeah, I'm very much opposed to the sticking your finger in your mouth, singing your own part of this. I mean, I know why people do it, but I'm also a bit like, you need to listen.
You need to hear what's going on around you.
You need to hear what's... I will say, there is this thing, I don't know if it happens in the rest of the world, it probably does, but like you can, and I've done this a few times, be a kind of a live session singer for choirs, where they will ask you in on the day to help them sing a piece, because usually because they've chosen material that's too difficult for the group, which I think is asking for trouble. But I've done this a few times where I've gone in and sung some pieces where I'm part of the choir, and my job is literally to make it sound better and more together. And then I think you kind of end up in the most extreme situation of group singing, where your job is to try and blend what is essentially something that isn't really working, and kind of make that blend together. But it's also extremely fascinating to then be like, right, what do I need to do? Apart from, the obvious stuff, like I need to sing in key, which I guess kind of goes without saying. But how do I use my voice as glue? And I think it's a very common thread when it comes to group singing, is how do you glue these voices together?
Yeah.
Have you encountered any fun techniques for making this happen in your choral singing life?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's I think that's something that I work a lot on in sort of choral contexts, because I think I've got naturally quite a bright voice. I can be a little annoying, I'm sure.
What are you talking about?
So
I don't understand. Annoying?
Oh, well, annoys me sometimes, but but sticky outy, I think, is what I mean. So but I think, I mean, obviously employing a slightly breathier sound works for a lot of the contexts that we sing in, but also I mean, just I think it's quite hard. I think it's because I've sung in choirs pretty much all my life, and also sung solos pretty much all my life. It's almost become like flicking a switch a little bit, like between the sort of choir voice and the and the normal voice. But in terms of like actually being glue, I think a lot of kind of focus on delivering things quite exactly. And definitely no sort of sharp edges, as it were, when they're not needed. Like unless it's specifically written. But obviously the sort of standard tricks as well, as like don't necessarily overpronounce, or possibly not even at all pronounce consonants at end of words. Like,
Yeah, it's interesting the sort of ways people work around trying to blend. It's I know that I've in the past. I mean, I'm much better at it now, but I have had some bad habits. Let's put it that way. When it comes to my choral singing in the past, and I don't think I ever realized just how hard it is to sing in tune until I got into the the
intricacies of it.
yeah, and it's not easy, and it's annoyingly we're so used to hearing exceptional singers every day on the radio, and of course we talked a little bit about this in the previous episodes as well, where it's something that people have worked on for years and years and years, and all you're hearing is the final product, and you know, it's hard to really appreciate how much work goes into singing, but also how much work goes into sounding like a unified group of singers, where all the singers are, more or less singing with the same consonant shapes and mouth shapes, employing
and
the
with
same...
the same intention as well. I think that's something that's, I mean, it sounds a bit wishy-washy, but but if you take a different approach to someone else singing the same song, then you're a little bit like, it might be interesting, but it might you're not necessarily going to get sort of unified sound.
Is there something going on your end, by the way?
Oh yeah, they're cutting down trees outside, I think.
Oh wow, good timing.
There's definitely a very loud truck or something. Yeah, I think it's trees that are being trimmed. Sorry.
I'm surprised that mine has generally been fine. I tend to have ambulances happen all the time, and today's you.
Yeah.
Oh well.
And I live on such a quiet road, and they chose this particular time to be less than quiet.
Well, what
but
can
hey.
you do? This is what live is. It happens.
It is. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, as I mentioned a while ago, we worked together on another project where we looked at exactly this, and then I wanted to find out how does, say, people's vibrato, for instance, affect stuff like group singing. And it is, I really, really like singing with vibrato. I think it's so much fun. But I'm aware that it's this thing where you have a lot of fluctuation in the pitch, and that is typically something that will make you sound separate. I mean, in the opera world, it's used for that very reason, probably, to stand out over, 15 trumpets.
Yeah, and it kind of like, I mean, there comes a point where it almost just has to happen.
Yeah, and it's
certain styles. Yeah.
It's a very extreme example of trying not to blend, making sure you stand out so that you can be heard throughout the room. And
yeah,
I think the invention of microphone has done so much good for being able to be heard, even if your solo voice isn't, a big bombastic, opera voice.
A big opera voice that's been trained for 10 years to produce a particular kind of sound.
Yeah.
In a particular kind of genre.
Yeah.
But that is not appropriate for certain music. I don't know why I keep hitting my microphone. I'm clearly very angry with it today. But yeah, I mean, and that's the interesting thing as well, and that's kind of what I meant as well about, like, if you take different approaches, like if you're in an ensemble and one person is singing a particular piece or a particular song like an opera singer, and employing those techniques and those methods, and then the person next to them is singing full-on pop with,
this is pretty much what we did when we tried to check out what happens, and it's really, really fun, but it's definitely
the
not.
result is interesting.
It's fun, but it's definitely not a blend of kind of sound. It's more,
no, it's not a unified sound. But then again, like, I mean, obviously sometimes it's. I'm sorry, I'm probably speaking much louder now as well because
that's fine.
Of this thing going on in the background.
The Zoom codecs are doing an okay job at isolating your voice, even though.
Oh, brilliant!
There's noise.
Well done, Zoom.
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay, but yeah, I have no idea what I was about to say.
That's fine. We sometimes
probably
lose our
wasn't
train
interesting.
of thought.
What were the words I used?
I can't remember. But
Nah,
okay, so
it wasn't important.
I think what we discovered is that you do need, if you're singing together as a group, there's a lot of stuff you have to think about that you
Yeah.
perhaps wouldn't necessarily think about so consciously if you're solo singing. You've got, you've gotten used to the stylistic features of whatever genre you're in. So you'll know that if you've got a pop song, you'll want to do a little shake at the end of the note and maybe, cut them quite short. You'll want to ornament them slightly. You've got all sorts of little instinctive things you'll do from your understanding of the genre. But if you're with a group and you do those things, the risk is, of course, that you'll then separate from the group and you'll sound more as an individual. And so I find that it's very tricky for me when I'm arranging to decide how much of those kind of individual qualities to preserve, to put into the arrangement, and then ask the singers to painstakingly learn exactly note by note, so that you still get that effect of the cool, ornamented pop sound, but it's all extremely together and it's completely planned out. Whereas if you're doing it as a solo, you probably won't plan all of those ornaments out because that's not the style. That's not what they do. If you're a jazz singer, you don't. Well, I say a lot of jazz singers do plan their solos, but you might not. If you're confident and you know what you're doing, you can, maybe have a few puzzle pieces that you then slot together as you improvise in a group setting. That is, in many cases, taken away from you. You have to know exactly what you're doing and when, and then any sort of improvisation that happens, depending on the style of music, might be more kind of planned out. They'll be like, okay, well, here we have these guys doing this kind of riff, which means that leaves space for this person to do their own thing. But then that's then stepping over from being a part of the group to then suddenly being the lead singer, if you will.
Yeah, no, exactly. No, it's interesting. And I think also what I was going to say, actually, I remembered, is like sometimes that kind of effect in a large group of singers is exactly what you want. Like you want everyone to sing with an individual sound, but in a collective, to create a certain sound, which works for some genres or some moments in some songs. And I think it can be quite exciting, but it would rarely be, I think, a sort of experienced choir singer's first approach to singing in a group.
I used to be in a big classical choir, and I was kind of thinking about stuff like blending, and then I was kind of complaining to one of the guys next to me, like, oh, I feel like I'm just like a drop in the ocean, and I feel like what I'm doing isn't really affecting it. And then he just said, well, yes, you are a drop in the ocean and you're not affecting it, so just have fun, just like sing it how you want, because ultimately there's 40 people singing your part. Like, your voice might not make that big an impact, but that's kind of the point. When you have that number of singers, you will kind of almost automatically get ensemble sound, because whenever the voices are to sing in the same note, they all strengthen each other. The second they step apart, then anyone who steps apart from it will disappear, because again, this is the effect of blending. That's is that anyone who's not exactly with everyone else will be masked by everything else, which means that ultimately you can kind of do your own thing when you have a huge group. And part of what makes gospel singing so interesting and fun to listen to is that there is an element of both. You have you have the sound of singers singing together, but also kind of doing their own thing at the same time, and it's really quite exciting to listen to. So there are certain genres where they kind of they cross that threshold, and you have ensemble and solo singing happening at the same time. But of course, you have to gauge whether it's appropriate for the situation. If you're singing motets together, one to a part, then you gotta
slightly different thing.
But I gotta say, I do agree with you. Like, singing in a small group is really exciting, because when you achieve, and I know that in barbershop music they call it the rigging chord, when you all match overtones exactly, and you start to get all the extra overtones of strength, and you get, it sounds like there's more singers than just the four or five of you or whatever. It's physically such a thrilling sensation to have that happen.
So cool.
It's
so cool.
So
yeah.
But yeah, anyway, it's I guess we can. What's the conclusion? I guess there's no really good conclusion here. Is you in most situations you wouldn't approach solo singing the same way as ensemble singing, but in some it's kind of allowed. Yeah, I guess that's a fair.
And like working as same way as working alone is different to working in a group.
Exactly right. I guess
it's as intelligent as I'm going to get today.
I don't know if anyone's minds are going to be blown exactly by this, but
but it was fun to talk about.
Fun to talk. I mean, ultimately, we like music. We like to talk about music, and maybe stuff is super obvious to us, and for someone else, it's like, wow, I never thought about it that way. Oh, that's really interesting. And
Maybe.
Well, I hope so. I hope that people find it interesting. Okay, well...
otherwise, the soothing sound of our voices is always blissful, I'm sure. Having just talked about how annoying my voice is, but yeah.
Well, and the great little cutting down of trees happening suddenly, and...
Oh, yeah. How's that?
Never a dull moment. Okay.
No!
Well, thank you very much for watching Scandi Pitches. Make sure to leave us a comment if you have any thoughts, if you think that we're completely wrong, and in fact, you should always sing like an R&B... R&B diva when you're singing motets. I don't know.
I would like to hear that, actually.
That would be quite a lot of fun. Maybe we should do it. We did kind of step into that, but with the Silent Night debacle. Silent Night. Okay. Be sure to share this video with your friends if you think it's useful. Leave us a comment if you have any opinions. If you have anything you want us to talk about, let us know. We are, we're very happy to take on suggestions.
Yeah.
And we'll see you next Friday.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.